She cheated with our son's best friend, then denied it and tried to gaslight me. But she messed with the wrong man. It started subtle, too subtle to notice at first. My wife had always been the social type, filling her calendar with dinners and trips, often with our usual circle of friends. She loved planning our vacations, but this time something felt off. 3 months before August 2019, we were planning a trip with our 3 kids. My son had just returned from school and I overheard my wife on the phone. Her tone was playful, almost coaxing. "It'll be just like last time, boating, walking the beach, snorkeling." It was how you talk to a child when you're offering them candy. I stepped into the kitchen. She froze, hand to her chest, startled as if I'd caught her in something. Then she smoothed it over like it was nothing. "What do you want for dinner?" she asked, though she'd already asked me earlier that day. At dinner, she casually dropped that Jason, my son's 21-year-old best friend, had texted her, wanting to join us on the vacation. My son looked confused. He hadn't told Jason about the trip. He was planning to invite his girlfriend, not his friend. Something clicked. Wasn't Jason the one she'd been on the phone with earlier? The way she'd acted, trying to persuade him to join us, now pretending like it was his idea. Jason. I've known him since he was 14 when he and my son met at summer camp. He's a good kid. Intelligent, well-mannered. My wife always liked him, maybe too much. She'd drive him places, take him under her wing. It made sense at the time. She's always had a soft spot for helping kids from tough backgrounds. Jason's parents, both African-American, work hard but live in the inner city. His mom would drop him off for basketball games at our house. I liked him too. He was mature for his age, almost too mature. But now, my mind was spinning. Why was she pushing him to join our trip? Why the secrecy? My son hadn't even invited him. I pushed the thoughts away, convincing myself it was nothing. Jason was just a kid after all. And my wife, well, she was just being her usual charitable self. But still, something about the way she jumped when I walked in, the way she covered her tracks so quickly, felt wrong. 3 days before our trip, my wife and our 18-year-old daughter went on a lengthy shopping spree. They picked up items for the trip, not just for us but for Jason as well. Gifts for him weren't unusual. She had a history of buying things for him since he was young. I didn't think much of it. The next day, my son's girlfriend arrived in the morning, and Jason joined us later that evening. It was a fun night. We went out to dinner, my wife beside me, Jason next to my daughter. But throughout the meal, I noticed my wife kept glancing at Jason. Even when I spoke to her, she seemed distracted, her mood unusually light. I didn't press her about it. I went along, thinking everyone's happiness should make me happy too. That night, after we got home, I went to bed. My wife stayed up with the kids. Around 3 a.m. she finally came to bed. The next day, as I went through my checklist before our trip, I noticed my credit card was missing. I searched through her luggage, thinking she had used it last, when I found something else. A revealing, open-back, bow-tied, crotchless bikini. It felt inappropriate for a woman her age, especially for a family vacation, but I convinced myself it was a surprise meant for me. The next day, we flew business class to Carlisle Bay, Barbados. White sands, turquoise waters, paradise, they say. While my family went off scuba diving, I stayed on the shore, pretending to read the Wall Street Journal. But my mind stayed on my wife, watching her every move. That evening, my wife, our son, his girlfriend, and Jason headed to a disco bar. Hours later, they returned, my wife tipsy, her face flushed. She woke me in the dead of night, desperate for intimacy. It was fevered, almost frantic, unlike anything we'd shared in months. I told myself it was nothing, just the excitement of vacation. The next day, she went to dinner with the kids and Jason. The kids came back. She didn't? Where's your mother? I asked, my voice too calm, too measured. Oh, she went on a wildlife tour with Jason. My son said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Inside, my chest tightened. Outside, the sea was dark, endless, and somewhere in the night, my wife was alone with him. That night, around 1 a.m., I woke up to find her side of the bed empty. I got up, hoping to catch the ocean breeze and wait for her. As I stepped into the living room, I caught movement by the couch. The TV was on, and there she was, lying on one couch, Jason on the other. She was wearing a revealing wrap-knot skirt, and under it, I recognized the bikini from her luggage. They were sitting apart, awkwardly focused on the TV, but the air was heavy. The scent of intimacy lingered, unmistakable. I may be losing my hearing, but my other senses are sharp. They had been close, I was sure of it. Had I opened the door slower, I would have caught them in the act. Jason was in shorts, shirtless. Normal for a beach resort, but the way he fidgeted told a different story. He was hiding something. I returned to the bedroom, and my wife followed shortly after, acting as if everything was fine. She pretended nothing was amiss, but I knew better. I could feel it, the closeness between them, the attempts to normalize what I had just seen. That night, I said nothing. I lay there, consumed by self-pity, humiliation, and loneliness. The betrayal cut deep. My hearing may have been slipping, but now it felt like my whole existence was fading, like I was becoming invisible to the people I loved most. I didn't sleep much that night. And by the next day, I knew I had no concrete evidence. Still, everything, from the moment I overheard her on the phone persuading Jason to join us on vacation, to that almost incriminating scene I stumbled upon, seemed to align. At that point, I strongly suspected my wife was involved with my son's friend. I had no clear proof, just a series of circumstantial clues, but it gnawed at me enough that I felt the need to confront her. That morning, I called her into the room and brought up what I'd seen. I asked her to be honest, to tell me how long this had been going on. Her reaction was explosive, completely unlike her. She denied everything, furiously accusing me of being paranoid. She even called me deaf, mocking my suspicion as if it were an absurd joke. Her tactic worked. She turned the whole thing around, making me feel guilty for doubting her. I had no hard evidence, and her outburst left me cornered. She even claimed I wasn't just losing my hearing but my mind too. Raising her voice, she insisted I was wrong, and I found myself apologizing, feeling like the bad guy. The rest of our vacation was a disaster. She treated me like I was an inconvenience, with a contempt I hadn't seen before. I felt I had lost something vital between us, maybe her respect. But deep down I knew what I saw, what I felt. I couldn't shake the conviction that she was gaslighting me, that something had happened with Jason. I just couldn't prove it. 2 days ago I confronted her again. This time she responded with the same denial but gave me the silent treatment afterward. Even the kids noticed something was wrong, though we didn't involve them. Oddly enough, I noticed she stopped being alone with Jason. She now only spent time with him when everyone else was present, as if trying to diffuse suspicion. This vacation was supposed to be about family, about us coming together. But instead it was tearing us apart. Our past trips had been full of closeness, fishing, picnics, family moments. I still don't understand why she insisted on inviting Jason this time. It's not like he hasn't joined us before. A few years ago we all went on vacation and I didn't think much of it. But looking back, I realize she's always been a night owl. Something happened, it was probably while I was asleep. Now, I can't shake the feeling that this affair has been going on for a while. Maybe she took more risks this time because she hasn't seen him as much with his college schedule. Thinking back, I wonder if her frequent late-night dinners with friends, especially when Jason was around, were really what they seemed. We only have 2 days left on this trip, and I don't want to carry this tension home. I want things to go back to how they were, so I pulled her aside and suggested we have dinner together, just the two of us. I took my wife to a secluded restaurant that evening. She agreed, and while the kids were occupied, we walked the 300 yards from our resort. I wore a floral shirt and she donned a sundress. We'd reserved a table with an ocean view. At the table for two, I stayed silent, hoping she'd start the conversation. I'd revealed too much too soon before, so this time, I wanted to make her comfortable, apologize for my accusations, and let her do most of the talking. I planned to watch her closely, waiting for any slip-up. Over the years, I had given her my trust and everything I had. Her betrayal, an affair with someone younger than my son, and her lies stung deeply. I had been the one to build our life and wealth, yet she seemed to think my success was due to naivety. My hearing loss and preoccupation with work had blinded me to her actions, but the affair with someone so close to home was the hardest to bear. After an awkward silence, she spoke first. She apologized for not spending enough time with me during the vacation and acknowledged that my suspicions arose from her close friendship with Jason. She looked me in the eye and said, "I never slept with him." I nodded, saying nothing. She went on to explain her understanding of my recent distance, partly due to my hearing loss, and her attempts to reconnect. She apologized for her hurtful remarks, attributing them to anger. She assured me of her loyalty and commitment to our relationship. Her words seemed positive, and I hoped this would lead to a more open dialogue. I admitted I hadn't been myself and expressed a desire for us to grow closer during the vacation. I avoided mentioning Jason or the affair. We enjoyed a romantic lunch, holding hands on the way back to the resort. The rest of the vacation was uneventful. My wife made an effort to spend time with me, but it felt forced, as if she were putting on a show. It might have been my mind playing tricks, but I felt a deep sense of betrayal. After dinner, the kids were none the wiser, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. I remembered I had installed cameras around the house: front porch, backyard, living room, home theater, and game room. They stored footage for 30 days before overwriting it. I hoped they might have captured something incriminating, something to prove I wasn't imagining things. Returning home, I was eager to review the footage, though I didn't want to get my hopes up. My wife knew about the cameras and had even encouraged their installation after seeing them at a friend's house. I doubted she'd be careless enough to act suspiciously on camera, but paranoia consumed me. I worried she might try to erase the recordings before I had a chance to review them. As we disembarked, I told my wife I wasn't feeling well and asked her to pick up a prescription for me. She usually handled such tasks, and though I didn't need a refill, it was a ruse to buy time. I claimed to have forgotten my medication at the resort and told my wife that I would take a separate taxi home with the kids to rest. Jason took a different taxi to his parents' house. As soon as I arrived home, I downloaded the footage from the cameras covering the days Jason had visited. It took some time, but I managed to complete the download before my wife returned. I kept a close watch on her, hoping to see if she would check or tamper with the camera storage. However, she acted as though the cameras were non-existent. It wasn't until midnight that we finished unpacking, and I was eager to examine the footage. When everyone finally went to bed, I connected the hard drive to my laptop and began reviewing the recordings. I fast-forwarded to the timeline of Jason's visit. On the night he arrived, he stayed in the guest bedroom, which was visible through the hallway camera from the game room. As I reviewed the footage, I saw my wife on the game room camera. The timestamp read 5:03 a.m. She met Jason in the hallway and they passionately kissed. For a brief moment, she playfully pushed him away and started to leave, but he slapped her on the bum as she giggled and walked towards the main area. It was clear they were having an affair. My heart raced as I realized I finally had the proof I needed. I wasn't angry but relieved to have concrete evidence. Just as I was about to close my laptop, I noticed my wife on the footage again at 1:15 a.m. She went to the guest hallway, presumably to the guest bedroom where Jason was staying. She didn't come out until 2:47 a.m., confirming a private encounter in the guest bedroom. Armed with this evidence, I didn't wake her up the next morning. Instead, I contacted my lawyer and was referred to a divorce attorney. After our discussion, I understood the significant financial impact of a divorce but knew I couldn't continue a marriage based on deceit. I wanted to protect my kids from knowing the full details but was determined that Jason would no longer be part of our lives. That evening, with the kids out of the house, I edited the video to highlight only the incriminating parts: the kiss and her visit to the guest bedroom. I called my wife into the room and played the video on my laptop. When she realized what it was, she covered her face with her hands, refusing to watch or answer any questions. I demanded details about their relationship, but she only sobbed. I wanted her to experience a taste of what she put me through during our trip. The only time I got a reaction was when I mentioned showing the video to our kids. She immediately stopped sobbing, looked at me, and begged on her knees, promising to do anything to keep it from our children. I laid out my terms. She would accept any alimony I decided on, and we would proceed with an amicable divorce based on my conditions. In return, I agreed to present our divorce as due to irreconcilable differences. The following day, we gathered our children to break the news. Despite numerous questions and their attempts to reconcile us, my wife stuck to the story that we had both been unhappy for a while and that separation was the best option. The night was emotional, with my wife trying to suppress her emotions to make it appear that she was initiating the divorce, but it was clear that I was the one filing. The kids sensed the sadness and it was a profoundly sad day for our family. I tried to stay composed but tears came when I was alone. It felt like another failed marriage and I couldn't help but wonder why I keep finding myself in these situations. After we told the kids about our separation, they understandably struggled with the news. My youngest daughter, now 16, took it the hardest. She couldn't understand why we couldn't work things out. The next day, my oldest daughter came to talk to me in the room that my wife and I used to share. My wife was now sleeping in the guest room. My daughter was upset and confused. She had tried knocking on her mother's door without any response and was struggling to grasp how things had gone so wrong. Just days before, we had seemed happy on our vacation. She sat beside me on the bed, her crying putting a lot of pressure on me. I reassured her that her mother would explain things once things calmed down. I told her that her mother and I had a good marriage and had raised 3 wonderful kids, but sometimes people fall out of love and that's what happened. I gave her a vague answer, and though she might have sensed there was more to the story, she didn't push further, possibly out of fear of what she might uncover. Since she was close to her mom, I figured she'd eventually learn the truth. The following day, I had an appointment with my otolaryngologist for a hearing aid that significantly improved my hearing. Meanwhile, my wife remained secluded in her room for a couple of days. We usually had dinner together, but the kids took their food to their rooms and I didn't see my wife all day. I ended up dining alone. My oldest daughter is a great cook and often prepares meals when she's back from college. Seeing the family fractured with everyone eating separately felt strange. It was a far cry from our traditional family dinners, exchanging kisses and going to church together. I had spent years building our family, only for it to be torn apart by an affair. Sitting alone at the dining table, I felt a mix of anger and doubt. I questioned if I was doing the right thing. I wasn't unhappy with the marriage before D-Day, and my wife had always been affectionate and attentive. She never denied me intimacy or made me feel neglected. I wondered if her affair with Jason was driven by an insatiable need or if he was just an easy option because he was available. I wished the affair had been with someone outside our close circle, though it wouldn't have made it easier. The next day, after my son's girlfriend left, I had a chance to talk to him. He didn't ask about the separation's details but wanted to know how I was coping. I knew he had been talking to my daughter based on his questions. A day later, my wife emerged from her sorrow looking like she had been crying a lot. Her eyes were swollen, her hair unkempt, and she seemed like she hadn't showered in days. That evening, we ate the dinner my daughter had prepared, sitting at opposite ends of the table. I felt like I should be the one hurt and crying while my wife should be the one begging for forgiveness. Instead, I carried the heavy burden of not being able to tell my kids about her affair. They seemed more concerned about her well-being, given how hard she was taking it. Normally, she was the life of the party, cheerful, nurturing, and caring. Despite my deep hurt, I had become skilled at hiding it and pretending that everything was okay. The next day my wife suggested we go to a restaurant. Although I wasn't keen on the idea, still hurt by her affair, I agreed. The tension between us and the kids made it clear that we needed to break the ice. If we were going to separate, it should be done amicably. We shared the same car but didn't talk much during the drive. Once we arrived and were seated, she immediately began her apology. She expressed deep regret for the pain she had caused and her betrayal of my trust. She admitted feeling so embarrassed and ashamed that she hadn't wanted to leave our room. She confessed to being selfish, driven by instinct without considering the consequences for those she loves. She emphasized her deep love for me and her desire to spend the rest of her life with me. She claimed she hadn't truly grasped the extent of the pain she inflicted until she was caught. I let her finish before responding. I pointed out that her remorse seemed to come from being discovered, and I stressed the importance of being honest with our children. Her expression shifted to distress. She lowered her head, holding it with both hands, then looked up with tears in her eyes, fanning herself as if hyperventilating. I remained stoic and didn't react to her dramatic response. After a moment of silence, she admitted that she knew she would eventually have to tell the kids the truth but needed time to gather the courage. She proposed the idea of an open marriage for me while she remained faithful, and begged me not to pressure her to tell the children, suggesting we keep it between us. I insisted she needed to tell the kids. When I asked her how long the affair had been going on, she claimed it had lasted 6 years, although Jason would have been in high school at the start. She explained that the affair began during our youngest daughter's basketball game. She and Jason had ended up alone in her minivan, leading to a kiss and intimacy in the parking lot. They had promised not to repeat it or tell anyone, but their encounters continued over the years. Before our vacation, she hadn't seen him for over 6 months. Jason's appearance during the trip reignited their relationship, and they were intimate again, which I discovered. She said she cared about him and couldn't resist being physically close to him, but her love for me remained strong. She described the affair as purely physical, trying to make me feel better. She admitted that her sexual desire had increased with age, and her frustration with reduced intimacy had led her to Jason. She had sought help from a psychotherapist and was prescribed antidepressants, but she stopped taking them due to side effects. She also used adult toys for relief but continued the affair. She maintained that Jason was the only person she had been unfaithful with. Listening to her, I felt bewildered and guilty, wondering if I had known earlier, I might have sought help to match her desires. She said she had mentioned her needs several times, though not in detail, and felt I had withdrawn from intimacy. She acknowledged that her sexual desire was unusually high and wanted to work on herself, recognizing I was already going through a lot. After our conversation, my anger somewhat subsided. I began to understand her struggles with intimacy, realizing it might be a borderline obsession. Although I had always known about her heightened desires, I hadn't taken them seriously. Her behavior was not entirely unexpected, but I had been dismissive, thinking it was a phase. I recognized my own selfishness and my failure to address her needs. While it was somewhat relieving to understand her perspective, I still believed that breaking our marriage vows had serious consequences. However, at this point, I began questioning my decision to divorce my unfaithful wife. Feeling the weight of uncertainty and needing clarity, I scheduled an appointment with my therapist. He recommended that, given the closeness of her relationship with Jason, she should cut off all contact with him immediately. I asked if he thought it was necessary to tell our children about the affair, but he explained that he couldn't assess their mental state or my wife's. He did mention, however, that Jason might inform them himself, so controlling the narrative would be important. Ultimately, it was up to me whether to disclose the affair, but if I chose not to, he advised instructing my wife to tell Jason their affair was over and that he should never contact her or any of us again. He also suggested a probationary period of 2 to 3 months, giving me time to evaluate whether I still wanted to go through with the divorce. Additionally, he recommended individual counseling for both of us and noted that couples counseling might help her express herself in front of an impartial observer. After the session, I was left with mixed emotions. I didn't know how I felt about the whole situation. But as I thought about my children, the years I had invested in my marriage, and the happiness we had once shared, I decided it wouldn't hurt to give the probation period a try. That night, I laid out the conditions to my wife. She had to sever all ties with Jason and never speak to him again. We also agreed that the affair needed to be disclosed to our son and oldest daughter, and they too would cut off contact with Jason. I made it clear that if she violated any of these terms, the divorce would proceed as planned. She acknowledged her mistakes and said she was willing to do whatever it took to save our marriage. While she feared how our children would react, she agreed not to divulge explicit details and to accept whatever consequences followed. As tension in the household began to ease, my children were still curious and uncertain about whether the divorce was moving forward, but they hadn't asked me directly. Gradually, we resumed having dinners together as a family, and life at home seemed to be returning to normal. However, my wife and I continued to sleep in separate bedrooms. After our conversation about revealing her affair to our son and daughter, we decided to address it that evening. After dinner, we sent our youngest daughter to her room and gathered my son and oldest daughter at the dining table. I began by explaining that their mother was the reason behind my initial decision to seek a divorce, but that we were now attempting to reconcile. For that to happen, she needed to come clean. When it was my wife's turn to speak, she struggled to find her words, tears streaming down her face as my children watched, trying to make sense of it all. Whether her tears were genuine or an attempt to soften the blow, I couldn't be sure. She began by admitting her disappointment in herself, acknowledging that she had made a terrible mistake by engaging in an inappropriate relationship with Jason. The room fell into a heavy silence. I glanced at my children to gauge their reactions. My wife kept her head down in shame, avoiding eye contact with any of us. As soon as she finished her confession, my daughter's jaw dropped, while my son exploded with angry expletives, storming off to his bedroom and slamming the door behind him. I stayed seated, watching the scene unfold. My daughter sat a couple of chairs away from me, processing what had just happened. After a moment, she whispered, "I knew it. I knew it." She then came over and hugged me tightly, and although I didn't respond, she clung to me as though seeking comfort. Meanwhile, my wife was sobbing openly, and I suspected my daughter was shedding tears too. Seeing my wife so devastated, I felt a pang of concern for her, something I hadn't expected. Eventually, my wife got up, still crying, and retreated to the guest room, closing the door behind her. My daughter asked if I was okay, and I assured her that I was. I explained that I had already had time to process the situation, and while I hadn't forgiven her mother, I understood why it had happened. I also told her that I didn't want to keep them in the dark anymore, which was why I had pushed for the truth to come out. That night, I went to bed with a clear conscience. I knew that the next day would mark a new beginning, and it was better to start with honesty than to continue living in deceit. The following day, my daughter made breakfast for me. My wife still hadn't come out of her room, and my son had already left the house. My daughter informed me that he was still upset and planning to move out, unable to bear being around his mother. Most of the morning was spent in conversation with my daughters, especially my eldest, who tried to lift my spirits and steer my thoughts away from my wife's betrayal. By the afternoon, my wife still hadn't emerged from her room, which began to worry my daughter. They had errands to run and were already late. She knocked on my wife's door for what felt like over 10 minutes, but there was no response. As evening approached and still no sign of her, I began to feel uneasy. I knocked on her door myself, but again no answer. Up until that point, I had assumed she was simply too ashamed to face our children. But now the situation felt increasingly strange. During dinner that night, she didn't join us. My son hadn't come home either. I called him and he informed me he was staying at a friend's place, still angry. So, it was just me and my two daughters having dinner. Still no word from my wife. The next morning, an unsettling feeling crept over me. Something wasn't right. I decided to force the door open with my oldest daughter's help. It was bolted from the inside. When we finally managed to get it open, we found my wife lying face down under the covers. Nearby, there were pills and a glass of water. Immediately, I told my daughter to call for help while I checked for a pulse. But her body had already started to change color. My younger daughter began crying, desperately shaking her mother, trying to wake her. My older daughter, on the phone with emergency services, was becoming more frantic by the second. It didn't take a doctor to see that she had been gone for nearly a day. I felt completely numb, torn between the urge to cry and the need to scream. I was drowning in shock and guilt, convinced that I had somehow caused this. It took a while for me to regain my composure, but by then the ambulance had arrived. They were already preparing to place her in a body bag. I don't know who informed my son, but by the time he arrived, he was sobbing uncontrollably. I spent nearly the entire night talking to the investigators, completely shattered. Thanks for subscribing. It really means a lot to me.